Brendan McManus, you're an Irish Jesuit and you're an author, and your first book was Redemption Road, which was about walking along the Camino that has become so popular in the last 40 years or so, and loads of people have done it, and people will know you from that book, Redemption Road, which you walked that road after the death of your brother by suicide, and how that Camino walk helped you. Your latest book, because you weren't done with your pilgrimages, was another pilgrimage from Loyola to Manresa, which is a Jesuit Camino pilgrimage. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Pat. So, that Manresa, or Loyola to Manresa, is the classic kind of Ignatian walk because it links together these key places in the story of St. Ignatius. So St. Ignatius was from the Basque country, obviously, and he was born in Loyola, in the castle of Loyola there. So to see the places where he was born, and especially in Loyola, that's where he had the conversion experience. After he'd been injured in the battle in Pamplona, he was taken home in a stretcher, and he was lying up for months in his bed there. And that's where he had the big insight about God was working with him in his interior and his inside. So then he set out on this journey to walk on foot over to Manresa, which is easily 500 kilometers more away. And that journey is a story of his life, really. It's a story of experiences, learnings, figuring out how God was working with him. And then in Manresa itself, which is on the other side of Spain, basically near Barcelona, that's where he had some key experiences as well. And especially the writing of the spiritual exercises, which is his great work, the great retreat, the great kind of gift to humanity. Then that's where he got a lot of insight. That's where he put it all together there.
And Brendan, this is a long walk. I mean, it's how long? 400 miles, is it? From Loyola to Manresa?
That's right. It's about 600 kilometers in total. Yeah.
And was it important for you as a Jesuit to do that walk?
That's really important as a Jesuit. It's really close to my soul. I think probably the main thing there was that I had done that as part of my training. As a Jesuit novice, you have to do all these different experiences, work in a hospital, do the long retreat. But this was the key one for me, walking across Spain with another Jesuit novice, but with no money. So you have to rely on Providence, and that was really tough. I mean, that was the toughest thing I've ever done. But that's where I learned the most. That's where I got this great insight about praying to God. Pray to God when you're in trouble. Don't be trying to do it all yourself, and letting go control, which runs right through this book that I've written, is the key theme, to surrender and to abandon yourself. But that's easy to say, right? But it's so difficult to do that in practice. Sometimes we have to arrive to these kind of liminal situations where this is kind of forced on us, and that's where we start to engage with the real ourselves and the real God, I think.
And that's what happens with you on these pilgrimages and the books that you write subsequently, is that you have real experiences. They're usually not what you expect. I notice that. And then from that, you are able to pray and understand Ignatian spirituality in a deeper way. And that happened very quickly, Brendan, it has to be said, on this pilgrimage, because you were fired with enthusiasm. You're in the chapel the night before in Loyola, you're praying, and you're in the place where Ignatius had his conversion, and you're fired up. Tell us what happens the next day.
Yeah. So yeah, it was really, really unfortunate. It was my second day, and I got up really early in the morning. What I like to do, up before dawn. It's still dark, and I'm walking through this town. I'm staying in a little guest house on the edge of town, and I could see the path where I was meant to be across town. So instead of going back into town, I could take a shortcut across this dual carriageway and get to the path. But of course, what I didn't reckon on was I was blinded by this car, by these headlights in the dark, and I stepped off the edge of the road, and I stumbled, went right down on one knee with the full weight of the rucksack, and it was horrible, a horrible injury, and cut my knee and everything. But it left me in bad shape, and I was limping, and I had to go and get help, obviously. So went to the nearest medical center, which was a couple of kilometers away. Hobbled along the road and got there, and it was bandaged up. But they didn't realize, of course, there was a deeper issue which they hadn't detected. So the whole walk is basically about me struggling along, not knowing what's really going on. There's an underlying issue which doesn't come to light until right towards the end. So in fact, I'd been to 3 doctors in a row, one after the other, and saying there's something wrong here, and they couldn't figure out what it was. But it's this story about the in between thing, you know. So I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to walk as best I can. I'm kind of limping along the road. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I'm trying to make decisions in a very difficult situation. You know, the pressure of injury or limping and not being sure about what's going on. And I think a lot of people relate to that. That's what people's lives are like. We're not completely sure. We don't have the whole picture. We're trying to do the best we can in the situation where we find ourselves. So that's what the walk is about. It's in some ways it's an unfortunate happening, but in another way there was really extraordinary things that came out of that, and certainly the learnings that came out of that, and what I learned about God, about myself, about prayer and discernment was extraordinary.
Well, what in a nutshell, to give me one thing that you may have learned then, and also I was thinking about Ignatius. I mean, he was such a pilgrim, wasn't he? I remember reading, like, he walked everywhere, and one of the most moving things I ever saw was his little shoes, which they have in the Jesuit house in Rome. But even hundreds of miles, and then they got him a horse eventually, and he gave the horse back. So what did you feel close affinity with Ignatius as well?
Absolutely. No, I felt really close to Ignatius. I mean, I was walking in his footsteps, literally on the same journey that he had done. But also, there's this thing about Ignatius that Ignatius limped his whole life. Remember, he'd had this he had this accident where he got shot with a cannonball and his leg was broken. His leg was reset, but it wasn't set properly, and he had a bit of a lump of bone sticking out of it, and he had to get that cut off. So one leg was shorter than the other. So he limped his whole life after that episode. So I was limping along the same road that he had gone, and I really felt close to Ignatius on a lot of occasions. And I think I got a new insight into Ignatius as well. I mean, I read about him limping, but I never understood what that was like until you actually do that, until you're actually suffering the consequences of that. There's something about being in that situation that means you're not in control, for sure. It puts you in a bit of a vulnerable position. It means that you're a bit more dependent on other people, on God's grace, on providence, you know. And you're not so sure about things. You're not so much on top of things. You know, you can't kind of swagger into town and take over situations. You're more hesitant. You're more kind of sitting back. You're more waiting to see what's going to happen, and you're trusting much more. You're trusting that something's going to come out of this situation. Something good is going to come out of it, and hanging on there, hanging on in difficult situations, and trying to find a way through. The other really interesting thing was that on this walk, I came across lots of other people that I wouldn't have met otherwise if I hadn't been injured. And one of the classic stories, my favorite story, is on the third day when I was injured, and I was staying up in the mountains in a shrine, a Ransazu, it's called, a Marian shrine where Ignatius had stayed. And in the morning, when my legs bandaged up, the doctor told me to take a day off. So I go down for breakfast, and there's a guy sitting at the table, and he's got all the hiking gear on. He's ready to walk, obviously. And I said, can I join you in Spanish? Because I speak Spanish. And he said, sure, join me. So I said, then what are you doing? He says, I'm doing the pilgrimage. I'm doing the Ignatian pilgrimage. He says, I'm doing it as a retreat. He says, but I'm really stuck. You know, I need a bit of help. And I said, well, how are you doing the retreat? What book are you using? And he takes out of his pocket this book. And of course, it's the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And that's my job. That's my job, to help people through the exercises of St. Ignatius, to guide them as a spiritual director. So the hair stood up in the back of my neck when I heard that, because I thought, this is providence if I ever heard it. So we had a big chat. I mean, you're not meant to do the spiritual exercises yourself. Just reading the book, it doesn't work. You need a guide, and you need someone to interpret the exercise and put them into modern language. It's quite terse and it's quite difficult to understand. So we had this big chat, right, in Spanish in this breakfast room. And I could feel the room was filling up behind me and people were coming in. And I said, I have to go for this. We have this one chance. And I'm trying to talk to him, trying to help him to get through these difficulties. And at the end, I showed him the examen, which is the review at the end of the day. I showed him where that was in the exercise. And I said, look, just forget about all the other stuff. Just do that one thing, that examen, and look for gratitude in your day. I mean, it was a beautiful moment, and he went off on his walk, hopefully a bit happier.
Yeah, because that's a beautiful prayer, 15 minutes, and the one that Ignatius says to all Jesuits, if you don't pray anything, at least pray the examen, isn't that right?
That's it, exactly, exactly. And the funny story was that the next day, he was a day ahead of me. I arrived in the next village in the boarding house, and this woman said to me, she says, oh, we've been expecting you. And I said, well, I said, impossible. How could you know? And she said, there was a guy here yesterday, and he said, watch out for the priest with the white bandages, which was me coming along, limping along the road after him. It was a lovely story.
Lovely story. Brendan, you did mention, and I don't want to sidetrack, you did say you learned a lot about God and discernment, and obviously that's in the book, and people can read that, what you meant. But maybe one little hint of how did your relationship or image of God change since you've already been on a big long walk? How was God revealing himself further to you?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest problem for me was you mentioned my previous book about the Redemption Road and the Camino de Santiago, which is another Camino route in Spain. And I was going in the opposite direction. I wasn't going to Santiago, but it felt like I was on the Camino again. But the problem was I had these expectations from the last time I did the Camino, which was an extraordinary experience. It was about the death of my brother and the grieving process. And I had this beautiful 11th hour, God touched me deeply, and it was really emotional. And I was expecting the same thing to happen, right? I was expecting, and the expectations really crippled me. They really limited my experience. And in some ways, the whole story was about trying to live in the moment, let go of the past, let go of the expectations. I mean, God is not in your previous experiences or what worked really well one time. God is in the now, the here and now, and in the openness of that, and there's a kind of anything could happen here. There's no rules about what should or what might happen. So just let go. So that theme about letting go control is probably the biggest thing that I learned. Just surrendering yourself to the situation. That's where God is, in the reality, in the situation, not in the past, not in your expectations or imaginings or idealizing it. So it was like a purification of expectations, of memory. Even it was about letting go of the past and just being in a new future and walking with God in this new way. But that cost me. I have to say, to let go of that and to be free. And this is the big Ignatian or Jesuit word. To be free means to be free to do what God wants for you and to let go of your own plans. So that's again not about letting go of control. I wanted it to work out in a certain way, and in some ways it worked out in a bad way for me, or the way I didn't expect. But in other ways it worked out, much better than I ever could have imagined, because I learned again about letting go and let God operate. And like I say, one of the big gifts was the people that I met along the way. That was just one story there I mentioned, but almost every single day I met another person. And again, I had another really profound experience meeting people, talking to them about their lives, even the recuperation process back at home. I started to live differently afterwards.
Yeah, tell me, because you had to recuperate when you went back to Belfast, which is the background picture that you have there on your screen. You ended up in hospital, and you put that in as part of your pilgrimage story. Why did you do that, Brendan?
Yeah, I guess one of my other little hobby horses is that often people go on the Camino, and often it's about a success story. People say, I did the Camino, I walked it in 4 weeks or whatever, and I had a brilliant experience, and I came home and it was fantastic. But that's not everybody's experience. A lot of people get injured. A lot of people have to give up, for example. A lot of people have to go home early, and they often don't get recognized, or they don't say anything about it. And I was thinking, hold on, there's something significant here. It's not just about the the glory or the big ending or the big finale, the big, emotional release at the end. I mean, this is probably true in my last book a little bit. So there was a movement for me personally, but it was moving beyond that and seeing that God is in everything. God is in the success stories, but also in the apparent failures. And I think even more so, if you think about the most useful experiences in our life are often the most difficult ones. We'd often say as Christians, those are experiences of the cross of Christ, where God works most powerfully in the darkness, in the dark night, in the difficulty. And that was my experience. So going back home, like you say, I had to go to hospital, I had to get x-rays and tests and everything. And then I was laid up and I was in a cast for a while and then on crutches while this thing kind of played itself out. And again, that experience was difficult. It was challenging. I was invited to let go again, just to be dependent, to recognize that God is in this and to be open to new experiences. So again, I met lots of people. I met lots of medical people. I met lots of people who helped me out because I needed people to give me lifts and to bring me around the place. But there was one story in particular where I was giving a course in the local parish, and it was about prayer and about God, the way God works in our hearts. And there was a guy who I'd met before who was helping me, and he had a bit of a problem with alcohol. And it was one day he didn't show up. He was meant to bring me to the talk, and I had to make my own way there. Somebody else give me a lift. And then afterwards, he was feeling really bad because he'd let me down. But we had this really profound conversation about, expectations, about compassion, about forgiveness, about the way God is, for example. But I got a real insight into the way he thought about himself and the way he thought about God and the way he kind of beat himself up a lot about making mistakes, And I was in the privileged position of being able to say to him, well, look, maybe there's another way. Maybe God is not so harsh. Maybe there is forgiveness. Maybe there is another way to see this. Maybe you can let go of some of that kind of pain and angst that you're storing up there for yourself. This guy became a great friend of mine, and we're still in touch because of that. And again, it was all fortuitous. It was all providential that I met a whole series of people just exactly like that through this experience of apparently being a failure and being a convalescent in some ways.
Yeah, because that's it. It's the failure is what is often very hard for people, and yet through your failure, so many things, as recorded in the book, are turned to good, and you learn so much. And I notice also that you talk a lot about letting go and surrender and learning to live in the now, and therefore you have a chapter which you use the 12-step AA spirituality. Is that the reason? Because it's very like that kind of spirituality where the first step is you admit you're powerless over alcohol or over other people. So tell me about that. It was interesting to see that chapter, Brendan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the last chapter where I try to summarize all the learnings for myself. So I used the AA framework for that. It just seemed to fit in perfectly. And obviously that was a result of meeting some of these people I met along the way. And I met this friend of mine, I'll call him Patrick, and he tipped me off to the similarity between the Ignatian spirituality and the AA approach. So it's very much what you said there. It's about handing over to God. So that theme about surrender is key. That in some ways my life is out of control, and in some ways I need God in my life. I need something to give me direction and purpose, and to have a clear guidance, or a GPS, I call it. There is this homing system within us that will bring us the right way if we can just release ourselves from all these other, addictions or getting caught up on smaller things. So I realized that when I went and did a bit of research on this, so there was a Jesuit that worked with the founder of AA, and they built in a lot of Ignatian spirituality into it. So the AA approach, the 12 steps, is very, very rooted and grounded. It's a very real spirituality. It's about finding God in the real, in the now. It's about integrating my life with what God wants from me. It's about making amends for what's happened. It's about changing my life and making better decisions, which I really like because it fitted in perfectly with where I was.
And Brendan, the book itself is called The Way to Manresa. So Manresa clearly has a special significance. What was that, and why did you choose that for your title?
Yeah, so obviously I ended up in Manresa myself, but I had to get the train there because obviously I got injured early on and I had to skip the last part of the walk. But being there and being in the cave where apparently Ignatius wrote the spiritual exercises there, I had some really profound moments there where I was connecting with the story of Ignatius again. But I remember there's this little insight which seems quite trivial, but I think it's central, where Ignatius was there and he was trying to study and he was trying to educate himself in order to be a priest. So he had to learn Latin. He was put in a class with these young boys. So it was a little bit humiliating for him. He had to start at the beginning, but at night he used to get these great insights and great flights of fantasy about prayer and meditation. And he was up half the night, and he was so tired the next day he could hardly function. And the insight was that even though these things seemed great and seemed from God, they weren't actually good for him. And that's paradoxical. That it seems these are great things, insights, and these contemplation things about God, and yet it was having a negative effect on him. So in Ignatian spirituality, it's called the angel of light deception, so that you get deceived not by a negative thing, you get deceived by a good thing. And a good thing can really throw you off because you don't question it. You think prayer is a good thing, contemplation, insights, these are all great things. Why would I question that? But everything's up for grabs, really. You have to be so careful. You can get sidetracked. An apparently good thing can bring you down a very bad road at the end of it. So that insight seemed to apply to me as well, that in some ways what I thought was really good things about the way I was living or making decisions, and even getting injured, that some of those things appeared good, but they were inviting me to a deeper connection with God. And there is a big ending in the book where I had to make this big decision about my ministry and my future. I'm not going to give away the story, but yeah, but you're gonna have to read the book to get that. But this big insight, which was really relevant to my life and ministry, was that gave me the key to it. This thing that I think is really good is not actually bringing me in a good direction. I need to step back and do some real discernment. So this is Ignatius's insight, which is in the spiritual exercise, and especially in the rules for discernment, and the second set of rules, which is a much more finely grained approach to discernment. He says, beware of getting carried away on the flush of success, or things go well or things look good. He says, be very careful, sit back, take your time, sort out what is really from God. So if I was to learn one thing, take one thing away, that would be it.
That's fascinating, really, because it's quite subtle and it requires, I suppose, really sort of reflection, prayer, conversation as well with somebody who knows you, if you're making decisions or trying to see where God is active in our lives. Because who wouldn't think that, oh, I'm getting great nights of prayer and great insights and mystical visions? You just would jump to the conclusion, all good here. And Ignatius saying, not necessarily so.
That's right. So some of the Ignatian rules for discernment are just brilliant. Like just to take your time, for example. Let's sit back a bit. Let's look at this. Let's look at the bigger picture. Let's talk it over with someone else. So for me, having a spiritual director to be able to do that, let's get a bit of a bigger perspective, and let's ask, some of the tough questions. Sometimes we have things that become sacred cows in our lives. Obviously here, I don't want to give away the end of the story, but there was something very close to my heart, which I had put all my life and energy into. And letting go of that was such a difficult thing, because seemed like the obvious thing, seemed like a great thing, and yet that wasn't what God wanted for me. And it was such a release to be able to finally hang that one up and to walk away and to be a better person for it,
Yeah. Brendan, the book, the other thing I really liked about the book, first, a couple of things I think people should know are going to read it. That is that the explanations of, as you say, the spiritual exercise is this wonderful book of Ignatius, which is nonetheless needs interpreting, and you need help with it. And I think some of the footnotes are great in terms of those explanations. Also, during each chapter, there's a shaded out page, and in that, the first one, you get a potted biography of Ignatius, and that continues throughout the book. Tell me about that.
That's right. I've already mentioned there that I kept bumping into people as I went along. So each chapter has a biography, either of someone that I met. So that guy that I met in the hostel, that was the hiker doing the spiritual exercises, give a little biography of him. Or it could be somebody like Ignatius, for example, obviously that I came in contact with his story. But there's also there's other people, like I was in Barcelona towards the end, and I was in the Sagrada Familia, the big church there. So there's a biography of Gaudi, the famous architect, the Christian architect, and his masterpiece, which is the Sagrada Familia, that famous church. And I was there and I saw the church and I had this wonderful experience there. So I thought just to give his story, and I mean, it's an amazing story about a vision and about a theology and about a way of seeing God in the world. And architecture is such a amazing representation of his vision for the world, and people see that, and people come from all over the world. It's such a beautiful thing. So yeah, so every chapter has a little biography, and again, it's not about me, it's about the people I came across that inspired me, if you like. And everybody has a story. I think everybody has something to offer, and my job was being open to the people that I met and the stories that I heard along the way.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't interrupt the narrative. If you don't want to read it or go back to it later, because it's in a grayer shade, you can just move on to the rest of your story.
That's right.
So, Brendan, this book is published by Loyola Press. Why should somebody buy it? To read, what would benefit somebody, would you think, buying this book and reading it?
I think it gives you a great idea about the way that God works in kind of unexpected ways and in the difficult situations of our lives. It's not a success story. Like I said, everything doesn't go right, and I think that's what people's lives are like. And one of the challenges I think people face is finding God in the mess, if you like. This is the title of another book I did with a friend of mine. But in the difficult situations and in the dark night, that experience of going through darkness and not being sure of the way and not being clear about where God is and how I should act and what I should do, it'll give you some great clues about how to get through that, how to approach that, and how to pray your way through that. Like I said at the beginning, the dark night is often an experience of the cross. The cross means that God is apparently absent. And my experience, a lot of people have this experience quite regularly. God seems to have abandoned me. And the temptation is to think just that God has left me to my own devices. And there is a way of praying. There is a way of going through those situations which will work out well in the end. If you can hang in there, and if you can pray with the difficulty, pray with the situation and the problem, pray with the problem is what I call it, that in its own will help you get through really difficult situations, and things will work out much better with God's help. I think that's a huge advantage in itself. I should also mention there is a music playlist that I also published with the book. So each chapter has a song associated with it. So in the beginning, when I fell in the headlights of the car, it's called "Blinded by the Light," which is a Bruce Springsteen song. And every chapter has a song. And I publish a playlist at the end, which is on my Facebook page as well.
And Brendan, what struck me there at the end is, as you said that about the failures and the darkness. We're in a dark time now in the COVID-19 crisis. Like, everybody around the world is experiencing some kind of grieving and loss, even just a loss of freedom. So the book would be important for people in that regard, I think, too.
I think it would really speak to people at this time. I often compare this time of COVID-19, I compare it to being on a retreat. It's like doing the spiritual exercises, because you're faced with all these things you have no control over. There's only a certain amount of things you can do. It's very hard to keep on track and to keep focused and to keep positive, because it seems like everything's out of control. It seems like this might go on for a long time. So having, again, a way of praying in the difficulty, in the darkness, a way of keeping on track. And that little examen prayer that I give to that hiker in the hostel, probably the single most useful thing to keep finding gratitude, even in the dark days and in the tough days. That will keep you on track. That little 15-minute technique will keep you focused, will keep you on track. and will allow you to get through those difficult days and hopefully come out in the sunshine at the other end.
It's called The Way to Manresa, Discoveries Along the Ignatian Camino, and it's published by Loyola Press. Can be got online, or how do people get it, Brendan?
Yeah, so it's on Amazon, or it's on the Loyola Press website, but it's been rolled out across all the electronic platforms. If you just simply Google The Way to Manresa, it'll come up in a whole lot of different forms.
A great read, another great read, Brendan, and wish you all the best with it. Thanks very much indeed for joining us from Belfast.
Thank you, Pat.